Lighting and rendering in Zbrush is probably quite different from what you have used in other software. Now, it uses a system they call BPR, and you can find it over here. This is short for Best Preview Render. Now, don't confuse this with PBR, which you might have heard about in other software like physically based rendering. PBR is their own system and it has absolutely nothing to do with physically based rendering. If you see renders from Zbrush and they look really good, you can be sure that they have a lot of post processing and a lot of hacks to them, because rendering in Zbrush is anything but physically accurate. Now, this is both a strength and a weakness. If you want physically based rendering, you should just use another render engine like Keyshot, which integrates quite well with, or something like Modo, Arnold, whatever it might be, which is going to do a fantastic job for that. But since it's not physically based, it means that they can do a lot of cheats and they can do a lot of really hacky and awesome stuff, something like non-photorealistic rendering. So you can get very stylized results in Zbrush, which would be almost impossible to get in other software. So instead of thinking that it's hacky to get realistic lighting in Zbrush, rather you should think about it as it's an opportunity to really get some crazy stylized renders out, and a way to really make sure that your renders or your models can really just pop. The model we have here can easily be found under projects, and it's under demo projects. And here we have the crazy mech. Now we have just saved this out as a C tool for you, just to make it easier, and it's called Lighting and Rendering 02. This just means that there aren't any materials assigned to it or anything like that. So let's take a quick look at what happens if we just hit the render button up here, the BPR button, or Shift R. I'm never really going to be clicking this button here, and you can also remove it from the interface if you aren't using it. So what you can see now, if you compare this to this, you can see that the result is just a lot cleaner as well. Everything has the same color and value now, and everything is just really nice and sharp. You can see also we have the addition of lighting as well now. If you click now everything disappears and you have to re-render. So this is something to keep in mind, that if you do rotate, then it completely destroys your render and you have to re-render. This is where we can go on the draw, and like we mentioned before, we can hit the lock button, or we can just click the lock button over here, so that it's harder for us to navigate around, but it still restarts the render. So let's look into some of the render settings. The very first thing we're going to take a look at is the floor. This is something we haven't really used up until this point, because there hasn't really been a use for it. And to be honest, I don't really use the floor a whole lot in Zbrush, apart from maybe rendering. If we hit Shift R now, you can see that we have the ground shadow here. Sometimes it doesn't work entirely, and I just have to navigate a little bit around to make it work, but it should work once you've been doing this a few times, once you going back and forth for a little bit. So now you can see it's actually casting a ground shadow here. So now that we know how to make it cast an actual shadow, let's go on into our render settings. This is a menu we've barely been using before, so let's get a bit familiar with it. If we just dock it over to the left here. So here we have some of the general settings. This is a mighty list of settings, and most of them we really aren't going to be using. We already talked about booleans, which we were using, and it is funny how that's under render, but don't worry about that too much. External renderer, this is where you can connect this to Keyshot. This is, as far as I know, the only render engine which actually connects automatically to Zbrush, and then you have a live bridge between the two. We're not covering this in this series at all. We're sticking internally with Zbrush. Then we have render properties as well. We really aren't going to get too much in depth into this, but here, what's important here is that if we want to have some of these properties when rendering, we can enable them here. This becomes important later on if we want to make sure that we render ambient occlusion. We have that here, SSS, wax preview, fibers, whatever it might be. It's really useful to bring these into the render. It's kind of like a render path system where now it's actually going to allow you to modify this later on. Then we have the different render passes as well. Now you can see that we have the shaded one, we have the compositor one, which is the one we're looking at. There's nothing in the AO because we haven't rendered that yet. We have a mask for it as well, which is res rendered, and we also have the floor, and we have the shadows as well. So you can export these out by just clicking on them, and then we can export them out, and now you can use them in a compositing software like Nuke, Fusion, even Photoshop, and you can just really compose it there. This is how I prefer to use it, because you have so much more control in Photoshop compared to Zbrush. But we'll cover some really cool techniques on using these in the filters chapter. Then we have shadows. If we hit Shift R now you can see that we have very, very harsh shadows. So let's see what happens when we change, for instance, the angle. Now you can see that the angle is a lot softer. It's basically like what angle is the light at. So no angle is going to be extremely harsh shadows, and very low angle or very high angles is going to give you very soft shadows. But you can see the quality is pretty terrible now. So what we have to do, we have to set the amount of rays up. So higher amount of rays is higher render times, but also softer and nicer shadows. So now you can see really nice and soft shadows on this. I really prefer to work with soft shadows as everything just seems more grounded. Like comparing this to, we'll click on it now, you can just see how much nicer it actually looks. Let's just lock the camera again. We can also change the global strength of the shadows and the floor strength. This is what I mean, that this is not at all a physically based system and is not based on any rules of physics. So if we just do a render now, and now you can see the floor strength is really high, which means that we have basically 100% black shadows. So let's see what happens if we set this down to something like 50. Now you can see that it's almost like 50%. So it's all the way down to like 10%. Now you can see they almost disappeared entirely. Then we set the global strength up. If we set this to 1, now you're going to see that the shadow is a lot stronger in these areas. And if we set the global strength all the way down, we're going to have basically no shadows whatsoever to speak of. I really prefer to have the global strength nearly at 100. Maybe you don't want it all the way, because it is nice to have some light in the shadows like this. And then I prefer to have a pretty high floor strength as well, because I really prefer to have the contact shadow. Ideally, for a more plausible result, you want this here to be the same value, just so that you... it just feels more credible. So otherwise you have a discrepancy between the two shadows, and that will look a bit weird. But again, this is up to you. You can stylize this in crazy ways. So it's really easy to get started with just setting up the floor, hitting render, and just changing some settings here. And now we get a pretty decent result. One thing we have to talk about as well is the lights. If we go under lights here, and then we just dock it over, now you can see we have the lights here. Now this is a very different system from what you are probably used to in other software. If you are using other software, you can see here the way it works is we have a sphere, and now we're just dragging onto the sphere like this. So if we want the light to be here, we can hit Shift R, and now you can see the lighting is going to change quite a lot. We're going to have shadows in this area here. So now it's quite different lighting, different below as well. So the lighting just changes drastically. What if you want the lighting to be from the other side? Like what if you want nice room lighting? Now you can just tap on it here, and this moves the light from the other side. So now if we just move it up here, you can see that we're going to get this like rim light feeling on it. So there we go. You can just tap it again, and then we get to the front again. So something like this is what I prefer. And if you want a second light, you can click on the light here as well. Just tap it, and then we get a second light. And we can click this here now, so maybe this becomes a rim. Something like this. Now we have this as a rim, and we can set this to a different color as well. With this comically large color wheel here. So now if you hit Shift R, now we can see what happens. Now we have a little bit of rim light here. And if we're going to go to the first one again, we can change the color. We can set this to something more complementary to this. Maybe a little bit of pink to fit the theme of Flip Normals. So now this is how you would change the light quality like this. You can also go to light type, and we can change the kind of light type it is. Currently it's set to spotlight. We can change this to also it's sunlight. We can currently change this to a point light, whatever it might be. But I prefer to use a sunlight for this. Again, this is not a physically based system. This is like an approximation of an approximation. You can also disable this. And one thing which is really cool is we have something called a light cap. So a light cap is kind of like building our own HDRI within Zbrush. So if we click new light now you can see that we are just placing the light here. The difference between this and this is that this is an actual map we're using, so you can export this out, and well, it's kind of like a preset, so we can just export out this entire preset. So we can make another light, new light, and this is a more modern system than using lights up here, and they do kind of similar things, but you can save out and load them in, and it's a very easy way to get good lighting. So strength all the way up, so we get something crazy. Change between the lights by going here, and then we can just move it around. So I feel I have a lot more control with light caps than I do with the regular lights. So yeah, that's a basic introduction to lighting and rendering in Zbrush for you. In short, we render by hitting the Shift R key and going up here. We can enable and disable the grid to get this nice soft shadows, or to get, contact shadows. Under the render menu, right here, we can change the strength of the global shadow strength and the floor shadow strength. We change the quality of the light here, how many rays is going to be. Higher rays means higher render time, but also nicer result. Angle means sharper or softer shadows. Higher number means really soft shadows. Low number means really harsh shadows. For lighting, we can go under lights and dock this over, and then we can change the lights up here, or we can use light caps, whatever you prefer. There's a huge library of light caps online as well, so if you just want some quick lighting, you can very easily get that in here, and you can just get started right away when it comes to lighting your character. And again, hit Shift R to get some nice lighting on your character, your model, whatever it might be. And this is ready for presentation. This is good enough so that you can show people off and you can get feedback on your work, or in some cases even for your final portfolio.